order if you want your presentations.
Hi.
Hi.
Good morning. Good morning. How are you?
We're good. Good.
Wonderful.
How are
Excellent.
you?
I'm doing well, thank you. So welcome everyone to the first session of Friday. It's Friday, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So we have two papers in this next session, Roland Faber's paper and Jeff Bell's paper. And it looks like, Roland, you are up first.
Yes.
So
Without further ado.
without further ado, thank you.
Okay, my title is taken from Whitehead, a poetic kind of rendering of the theme, Uniting Earth to the Blue of Heaven Above, Strange Attractors in Whitehead Symbolism. Now, we'll encounter that we all talk about probably a bunch of the same quotes. So they will be tiring over time, but I'm still the second doing it. So
Scheduled yourself
Yes.
carefully.
Symbolism is maybe one of the most obscure books of Whitehead's oeuvre, in between grand projects, small in appearance, lesser known, and sometimes considered superfluous, since it's also rendered in process and reality. Yet strangely, this book directly addresses political philosophy, which Whitehead doesn't do very often, and forgoes any reference to religion and God, at least explicitly. All of its elements relate to thinking the body, philosophically, socially, ecologically, embedded in the evolutionary development of organisms. The whole field of subjects, again, is developed from Whitehead's understanding of perception. In the end, we are left with questions of survival, depending on our ability or failure to symbolize the world and the future in successful ecological cultures of perceptivity. I will consider symbolism as a series of strange attractors. Being attractive, they are not strange because they are foreign to expectation, but because they reveal a surprising connectivity. In a way, I want to look at Whitehead's text through the lens of Deleuze's conceptual movement of infinite speed for the ones who know what I'm talking about. For the others, doesn't matter, you'll see. This shows in the title taken from the dedication of the book, which entertains the curious symbolism of a silver thread uniting us to the blue of heaven above. In this shortened version, quotations from symbolism will be stitched together into three folds on categories, on perception, and on organization. So first one on categories. In Whitehead's symbolism, universalization and categorization originate in an activity of synthesization. This activity does never completely disappear under the weight of their constellations and accumulations, projections and postulations. It always in disguise contributes itself to the abstractions it entertains and the categories we form, even if the image of the world might indicate the reverse. First quote, this so-called wall contributes itself to our experience only under the guise of spatial extension and combined with sense data, which in this example reduced to color alone. I say that the wall contributes itself under this guise, in preference to saying that it contributes these universal characters in combination. For the characters are combined by their exposition of one thing in a common world, including ourselves, that one thing which I call the wall. End quote. In other words, the experienced is not a collection of these large universal characters, but of attributes located externally to and away from us. The experienced is never reached in itself either, as it is objectified for us. We, again, are also constituted by a series of events that in their togetherness with the wall are the world out of which this setting apart happens. In this wider connective disguised nexus, attributes distributed throughout their connective site, while the nexus remains inexplicable by attribution alone. This appears to be a countermeasure to the dangers of both essentialism and non-essentialism. While essentialism postulates a substrate in which attributes inhere, non-essentialism is in danger losing along with the underlying essence the activity that does the attributions, ending in floating generalizations devoid of continued connection. Yet, as Whitehead states, all real togetherness is togetherness in a formal constitution of an actuality. And this nexic togetherness happens by way of the activity of objectification. Quote, thus, objectification itself is abstraction, since no actual thing is objectified in its formal completeness. Abstraction expresses nature's mode of interaction and is not merely mental. When it abstracts, thought is exhibiting itself as an element in nature. Synthesis and analysis require each other. End quote. The historic route of the wall is not a mere substantial cause or an abstract effect of attribution, but the nexic oscillation by which synthesis and analysis require each other. In other words, construction and deconstruction are not enemies of processual reality, but the very activity by which any abstraction is contingently situated, as well as the effect of the very act of effecting. Read in the context of the oppressive inscription and performative interruption of substantive regulations, as Butler might say, abstractions do not constitute regimes of intelligibility, but become the means of creative activity by which it creates itself as a nexic route of consistency in which it remains available as process of novelty. Hence, although some would conclude that abstraction either equals the loss of particularity and originality, or even worse, is the enemy of liberation from the regimes of suppression and prejudice, here, in Whitehead's text, it is abstraction that cuts through and always anew redistributes fixed categorical generalizations and dichotomies, some would say binaries. Hence, as nexic activity, objectification undermines the binaries of nature and culture, active and passive, substance and sight. In fact, essentially being an ingredient of any actual happening, forming a connective character of a route of occasions, but also undermining it at the same time, objectification is the link by which nature and culture cannot be set apart, either by ontology or a law. Binaries, not abstractions, are the enemies of synthesis and analysis as they hold them apart. In fact, given the mutual requirement of synthesis and analysis, even the hardwired binaries of mind and matter are of pure convention. Quote, it is a matter of pure convention as to which of our experiential activities we term mental and which physical. But much of our perception is due to the enhanced subtlety arising from the concurrent conceptual analysis. Thus, in fact, there is no proper line to be drawn between the physical and the mental constitution of experience. End quote. The same holds for matter and form, so prominently separated by Platonic modes of thought. Instead, Whitehead says, quote, Aristotle conceived matter, hyle, as being pure potentiality, awaiting the incoming of form in order to become actual. The notion of pure potentiality here takes the place of Aristotle's matter, and natural potentiality is matter, which, with that given in position of form from which each actual thing arises. End quote. As matter and form are modes of potentiality, the term potentiality again hints towards another binary disappearing before our eyes, that of possibility and activity. Instead of their binary function in a hierarchy of classifications, they form only a conceptual instrument of objectification, shifting perspectives concretely together in synthesis, and in its analysis or deconstruction, only propelling the motive forces of processuality. It is interesting to mention on the side that Rorty, in one of his papers on hartshorn, claimed that as matter is potentiality, Whitehead's primordial nature, the synthesis of pure potentials, is material and not, as the Platonic expectation projects, mentality divorced from the world of matter. Similarly, Deleuze's virtual events, yesterday we referred to them shortly, will not fit the binary opposition of form and matter, potential and activity either. As this connective activity of objectification happens in and as process of perception, this leads to the second part on perception. Now, as also already mentioned, and probably not the last one, Whitehead analyzes the philosophic tradition's use of presentational immediacy as foundational mode of perception while reconstructing causal efficacy from it. Whitehead reverses the order, but also uncovers their mutual functioning as the origin of symbolization, the major subject of symbolism. What I'm interested in here is how these modes of perception and their coordination further the vanishing of binary stratification in favor of mutual immanence, as Whitehead will call this procedure in Adventures of Ideas, or here he calls it mutual requirement. While it may be true that Whitehead, in order to upset the order of stratification, seems to reverse their order, actually he does not create a new binary, since both modes constitute, and I will add, as a mutual requirement, are constituted by a third mode, the synthesis of negotiation between them. While Whitehead insists on the evolutionary emergence of presentational immediacy, which tradition has considered foundational, in context, I think he does so in order to demonstrate the contingency and arbitrariness of the foundationalism upon which the philosophic tradition has based its understanding, not only of human perception, but of nature and the various culturally ingrained binaries. To be clear, it is my contention here that despite the seemingly evolutionary separation of the two pure modes of perception, causal efficacy and presentational immediacy, they actually function, although with different degrees of integration, in mutual requirement, expressive of the inner workings of processes of objectification. The emergence of presentational immediacy is then rather one of shifting importance of mutual function. In fact, Whitehead seems to imply this mutual requirement with his, quote, doctrine of the two types of objectification, namely causal objectification and presentational objectification in process and reality. Similarly, Whitehead remarks that the symbolic reference between these perceptual modes is the active synthetic element contributed by the nature of the percipient, which is the self-production of an occasion of actual existence, so that it is one primitive mode of synthetic activity, In any case, with the differentiation of two basic modes of perception, Whitehead, I propose, captures Derrida's metaphysics of presence and its nemesis difference. Indeed, presentational immediacy functions as an atemporal, non-spatialized, non-differed, and non-deferred solipsism of the present moment, constitutive of a metaphysics of presence. Quote, again, a vivid enjoyment of immediate sense data notoriously inhibits apprehension of the relevance of the past and the future. The present moment is then all in all. In our consciousness, it approximates to simple occurrence, end quote. Instead of Derrida's deconstruction of presence or the present as mere mirage of a self-contained absolute, however, Whitehead understands the unlimited expansiveness of the present moment neither to be suggestive of a static eternity nor of illusion. Instead, it presents itself as a mode of synthesis that excludes temporality, causality, and history in favor of mere occurrence in the now, and hence is a highly abstract modification of synthesizing causal influences gathered to a moment of active togetherness. In this moment, the present is real in the sense that in it, quote, the world discloses itself to be a community of actual things, which are actual in the same sense as we are. This is actually the basis for the realism of Whitehead. In other words, presentational immediacy feels like all in all, yet in it, it is the choric medium of intercommunication that, not unlike Deleuze's omnitudo and all one, shines through in its infinite expansiveness. Oceanic feelings are real, but they are incomplete elements in a process of negotiation of time and space and rights of occasions. Conversely, Whitehead's causal efficacy resonates well with Christever's and Irigaray's Cora, the realm of pre-symbolic and poetic materiality that is not yet contaminated with the phallocentric law of patriarchy. Yet Whitehead also escapes Butler's charge of essentialism against these approaches since the lexic activity, as it is engaged in negotiation between both pre-symbolic modes of perception, remains arbitrary in their symbolic reference. Quote, "The nature of the relationship of the symbol and its meaning does not in itself determine which is symbol and which is meaning. There is no component in experience which are only symbols or only meanings." End quote. The determination of truth is now a limited problem within the process of symbolization. A symbolic negotiation is engaged in processes of contingent interpretation, and again, not only as human activity. It issues in a creative synthesis indicating novelty by referential error. And now there's this quote that probably everybody will bring, so I shorten it. It's Aesop's fable and the dog and the water and the reflection. Central sentence being, in the initial stages of mental progress, error in symbolic reference is the discipline which promotes imaginative freedom. As truth and error dwell in the world by reason of synthesis, symbolic negotiations may fail. No, it's more than 5 minutes, because you came in late. And it's only 20 minutes, so I have another 10 minutes.
Okay, I'm
Half
sorry.
hour.
I just.
Half an hour.
Okay,
Sorry. Clear?
I'm sorry. I thought it was 20 minutes.
No, it's 30, up to 30 minutes.
Oh, I
and
see.
I use the time.
I see.
Okay, so let's begin again. The truth, as truth and
But
error.
just to point out, I mean, Joe did tell us it was 22.
Yeah.
What?
Joe did, where's Joe?
Oh, okay.
Joe, I think, sent out an email saying we were going to get 20.
Yes,
20
and
minutes
so
each.
when we say 20, you need always 30 anyway. So.
Good.
Now we know.
All right.
Very good.
Whitehead time.
Whitehead time. Sorry.
No problem. I try to pick up here. As truth and error dwell in the world by reason of synthesis, symbolic negotiations may fail to either correspond to expectations or to cohere to ideals of harmony, or they may fail altogether. Nevertheless, novelty is not popping out of nothing, but out of the creative incompleteness of this process of objectification. To the extent that objectification is a synthetic activity of symbolic reference, its arbitrariness promotes imaginative freedom. The mutual arbitrary reference of the causal and the atemporal again implies that no experience in its full sense can be uninterpreted. Error becomes another word for the inexhaustibility of referential modes of symbolization yet unexplored. Further, insofar as symbol and meaning are not essentialized by pinning them to either mode of perception or activity of synthesis, in the analysis of these processes, we will also not discover binary essentializations. This implies an intriguing irritation in Whitehead's text. Quote, "The contrast between the comparative emptiness of presentational immediacy and the deep significance disclosed by causal efficacy is at the root of the pathos which haunts the world. Sometimes, in some tired moments, there comes a sudden relaxation, and the mere presentational side of the world overwhelms with its sense of emptiness." End quote. Two things become obvious in this quote. First, significance is relegated to causal efficacy in the realm of materiality and poetry, of causality and seriality. It is not, as in Derrida, uncoupling differences from significances, or, as in Kristeva, only reserved for the life under the symbolic law, as opposed to the semiotic chora. Rather, significance comes with the pre-symbolic causal connectivity in the process of objectification. Second, the breakdown of symbolic negotiation can lead to modes of consciousness or altered states of consciousness in which, in relation to causal efficacy, the all-in-all of presentational immediacy exhibits a deep and expansive feeling of insignificance, of non-signification. I will only mention here that this experience is central to Buddhist consciousness training, the letting go of any signification process as the appearance of wisdom. Non-essentialism pure. It is also implied in Whitehead's presentation of Hume's non-essentialist understanding of the relation of occurrences in symbolism. One is tempted to say, with Buddhist philosophy, dharmas, but I will not go further into this. 3, on organization. Through symbolic negotiations, Whitehead's activity of synthesis is mutual function or dysfunctioning of perceptual modes of objectification creates, sustains, or destroys organisms. Quote, our most immediate environment is constituted by the various organs of our bodies. Our more remote environment is the physical world in the neighborhood. But the word environment means those other actual things which are objectified in some important way so as to form component elements in our individual experience. In other words, bodies as bodies are complex multiplicities of synthetic activities of significant symbolical objectifications, propelling the evolution of organisms. Conversely, no body can escape the contrast between the symbolic and the pre-symbolic. In difference from Derrida, Irigaray, and Kristeva, however, for whom these two realms are opposed, Whitehead's complex pre-symbolic reality of bodies is in itself the symbolic play of differences. Again, for Whitehead, presence is pre-symbolic, and the symbolic is a relation within the pre-symbolic, as it were. Hence, symbolic negotiation is, on a very profound level, the organization of temporal and spatial structures themselves, carrying the signatures of the mutuality of causality and presence, materiality and mentality, externality and inwardness, extensity and intensity. Quote, the bonds of causal efficacy arise from without us. They disclose the character of the world from which we issue, an inescapable condition around which we shape ourselves. The bonds of presentation immediacy arise from within us and are subject to intensifications and inhibitions and diversions according as we accept their challenge or reject it. End quote. On the level of communities of organization, the same principle of mutual immanence prevails. Quote, the world is a community of organisms. These organisms in the mass determine the environmental influence on any one of them. Thus, the community as an environment is responsible for the survival of the separate individuals which compose it, and these separate individuals are responsible for their contributions to the environment. End quote. And it is on the level of ecological mutuality that this principle demonstrates again its most interesting counterintuitive feature, that of arbitrariness and mutual transcendence. Here, Whitehead is not in agreement with holistic concepts of interrelatedness. On the contrary, holism is upset by the inverse movement of a vast causal independence of contemporary occasions, providing a welcome environment for irresponsibility. It is this disrupted connectivity, never amounting to a closure of system or a stagnation of processes of becoming into fixed states of being, which facilitates novelty, creative advance, the unprecedented, and the infinite processuality of becoming. Yet, it is also the harbinger of chaos, destruction, transformation, and doom. In any case, survival is a matter of symbolization. Quote, thus, mankind, by means of its elaborate system of symbolic transference, can achieve miracles of sensitiveness to a distant environment and to a problematic future. But it pays the penalty by reason of the dangerous fact that each symbolic transference may involve an arbitrary imputation of unsuitable characters. It is not true, this is my favorite quote, it's not true that the workings of nature in any particular organism are in all respects favorable either to the existence of that organism or to its happiness or to the progress of the society in which the organism finds itself. No elaborate community of elaborate organisms could exist unless its system of symbolism were in general successful. End quote. For the evolution of organization, arbitrariness of symbolization functions as necessary discontinuity by which symbolism becomes a matter of practice, of empirical tests, pragmatic satisfaction of truth, and reminding of me of Derrida's last interview of survival, not of the fittest, but of the most sensible. Here, symbolism is prophetic, and its prophetic foresight is based on perceptive sensibility. Ecological consciousness is the ability to use arbitrariness as artistic instrument in the development of perceptive sensibility for and the transformation of expansive environments throughout space and time. However, the successful, Whitehead says, great societies of the universe need not to be of human nature, and even if they are, their evolution will also reveal revolutionary forces of novelty at play. Hence, Whitehead captures the success of symbolization for the evolution of organizational refinement with both reason and gravitation in light of the disruptive arbitrariness of symbolization. Quote, reason can be compared to the force of gravitation, the weakest of all natural forces, but in the end, the creator of suns and stellar systems, those great societies of the universe. The doctrine of the disruptive tendency due to novelties, even those involving a rise of finer levels, is illustrated by the three revolutions which secured liberty and equality for the world, namely the English, American, and French Revolution. End quote. As both forces, reason and gravitation, are expressions of creativeness, but in a weak way, yes, that dwells upon the tender elements in the world, as Whitehead says somewhere else, one is reminded of Walter Benjamin's weak messianic force and Derrida's permanently deferred justice. They seem to induce survival through gentleness, a major concern of Whitehead in later years. But as the messianic force shocks and justice upsets oppressive continuity, they leave a gap for the suspension of established symbolisms that both devastates and refines social and ecological sensibility. Because of this gap, symbolic references, when their character has become outworn, will culminate in eruption, breakdown, and a complete refiguration of symbolic meanings, arbitrary as the ones before, but if they work together towards ecological sensitivity, more apt to the environments in which a new organization could survive while sustaining its environment. This is the one prophetic truth of sociological nature in Whitehead's text. With the warning, what will happen if human society was not to become a great society of the universe, Whitehead leaves us at the end of the book. In a sense, this ending is Whitehead's symbolic testament. Quote, the art of free society consists first in the maintenance of the symbolic code and secondly in fearlessness of revision to secure that the code serves those purposes which satisfy an enlightened reason. Those societies which cannot combine reverence to their symbols with freedom of revision must ultimately decay either from anarchy or from the slow atrophy of a life stifled by useless shadows. May we find our way.
Amen.
Amen.
Thank you.
Time.
All right. So would we like to do
Yeah.
both
Let's back to
papers
back
and
then
then?
have time.
Okay.
Okay, excellent. So 30 minutes.
Okay. All right. More time than I thought. I'm going to start just saying a little bit what I set out to do in this paper. When I sat down to write the paper, I was kind of thinking through these issues, and I ended up writing a 30-page paper, 9,000 words. So I could read that, but I would have to read really, really fast. So I'm not going to do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to summarize all the arguments and main points from the paper.
Yesterday.
And summarize the points and main arguments and read a few passages from the Symbolism book and hopefully generate some good discussion as I go forward. But the main point of the paper, the main sort of the starting point that got me started was to compare and potentially contrast what Whitehead means when he says that what he's doing is a philosophy of organism. Okay. He characterizes that's what his project is set forth a philosophy of organism. And I want to compare and contrast that with what Deleuze and Guattari say in What is Philosophy when they talk about inorganic life. And I will argue that there's some very key elements going on in both Whitehead and Deleuze that a number of people, Roland and others, have seen over the years, that there's a lot of interplay between what Deleuze is doing and what Whitehead is doing. One of the distinctions I develop in this particular paper is a way of kind of thinking through what Whitehead and Deleuze are up to is a distinction between panpsychism and panvitalism. I know Stephen Shaviro mentioned panpsychism last night. I'll explain that distinction going forward. And the other important issue for me in kind of thinking through that distinction is precisely the notion of symbolism, as Whitehead develops it in the book. That is sort of a mandate for all of us here gathered to kind of think through symbolism and Whitehead's lectures on symbolism. And one of the things that kind of pressed upon me as I read through this book was thinking through non-human thought. What is non-human thought? And in particular, for me, my interest is in a sort of a non-representational thought. And part of my interest or reason for that is that for those who are familiar with Deleuze's work, he is very much involved in a sort of critique of representational thought. You can certainly look at analytic philosophy and many aspects of philosophy as being kind of beholden to a sort of representational model of thought. And with respect to thought itself, as I mentioned in my paper, there's a long tradition in philosophy that the certain sign of thought is language. That language is, as Descartes says, it's the one certain sign that we have that thought is going on, that thought is expressed in language. And more recently in analytic philosophy and ethology, animal behavior, and other disciplines, they've come to recognize that there is thought in animals that isn't expressed in language. And so I explore some of that, especially with the work of Elizabeth Camp. She's a philosopher at Rutgers. And kind of tie that into what Whitehead and Deleuze are doing as a way of kind of sort of thinking again over this issue of what is thought. And I think the Symbolism book that we have here with Whitehead will give us a fresh look on some of the big issues today, especially about metaphysical issues, about realism, anti-realism, and some of those other subjects that have been brought up by others here, and I suspect others will bring it on as well. And as I go forward, I will cite some of my favorite quotes from this book as well, and beat some of you to the punch probably as well as I do that. So first off, I want to kind of clarify this distinction that I'm making between panvitalism and panpsychism. That's just sort of let me get some of these terms straight right off the bat, and then I'll kind of go in. The sort of the panvitalism aspect is characterized by some of the quotes you find in Whitehead where he says, a rock is nothing else than a society of molecules. Okay, and then another quote, he says, all physical response of inorganic matter is instinct. So there's this sense that whether it's a rock or whether it's anything, actual thing, it's a society. It's a multiplicity of other things that are brought together. And anything that is brought together like that risks falling apart. Okay, so there is a kind of a normative obligation as Whitehead talks about later on in the Symbolism book, a certain sense of rules or a certain sense of constraints that hold the society together. And so that's sort of the panvitalism. All things have some sort of conditions for sustainability, for sustaining themselves. The panpsychism, I use that term to talk more about the individuating experience, the unity of experience itself, which in the Symbolism book, Whitehead refers to electrons as well as men have a unity of experience. Right? Even an electron has a unifying experience. Now he talks about that in the context of history, and Roland mentioned that in his paper when he was talking about Caesar, in the sense in which Caesar's life is a kind of life history, and so on and so forth. Now, obviously, human beings have a much more rich life experience or unity than an electron does, and so one of the things that I want to address today is what is that richness? What is the difference between an electron or a rock and a human being? And I think symbolism comes in as an important concept for Whitehead to kind of help us think through what I would argue is a continuum between a rock and a human being, rather than difference in kind. And I think that's this sort of ontological gap that you'll find in certain accounts of human reality versus non-human reality is something that I think Whitehead's work would lead us to challenge and reject, at least in my reading of Whitehead. So as I set this out, I have the papers divided into 3 sections. In the first section, I look at, primarily that's where I look at Elizabeth Camp's work on putting thought to work or putting concepts to work, where she spells out that for animals, including dogs, so I won't talk about Aesop's dog because everyone else has already done that, but you all know what I'm referring to now when I do mention that. But I have dog in my title, so I feel like I have some right to mention it. So even dogs and other animals have a form of minimalist thought. So I'll go into what is that. But dogs have some limitations with respect to that thought. And in the second section, I'm going to talk about what is some of the reasons why traditional philosophy identifies thought with language. What is it about language that's so special with respect to associating thought with it? And then in the third section, I argue that some of Camp's arguments and some of the other arguments don't do justice to the creative aspect of thought, to the creative aspect of what it means to think. And that's where I think both Whitehead and Deleuze come back together again, or where some of their most profound work comes in when they're thinking through creative process. I think that's where they're both cut from the same cloth, so to speak. Okay. All right, section 1. Elizabeth Camp, in her essay, claims that there are 2 main characteristics associated with what she calls full-fledged thought. Okay, so when she's talking about thought in the fullest sense of the term, one is that thought entails sort of recombinability of representations. And stimulus independence is the first criteria. And the second is that it is active, self-generated, and not a passive response to stimulus. Okay, so let me give an example of this, a dog. Okay, so Camp gives the example of a dog. I talk about that in my reading. I have a dog. She's a Springer Spaniel, kind of a nervous dog. And I have several dogs in the neighborhood. And whenever I go out, take her for a walk, she will see the neighbor Cocker Spaniel next door as a friend, playmate, and running and playing. The Labrador across the street is a threat, and she barks and so on and so forth. The poodle down the street is an annoyance. And there's this old golden retriever down at the other end of the street that she really just kind of pretends it doesn't exist. So, but there's some times where the Cocker Spaniel next door is out the box, just acting crazy. And she will then, for a week or two, turn around and treat the Cocker Spaniel as a threat, and bark and so on and so forth. So what's going on there? So what basically what Camp is doing is following in sort of the analytic tradition. Gareth Evans is an important analytic philosopher, 1980s, has this notion of what's called the generality constraint, meaning that if we're able to use concepts such as Jeff is happy, to be able to employ this concept of Jeff is happy, we should also be able to say that Jeff is sad, Jeff is tall, Jeff is other nodes, being able to employ other concepts to the subject, and also employ other subjects related to the concept. So Paul is happy, Paul is tall, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a sense in which part of what being able to employ concepts or put concepts to work entails, being able to recombine them given different circumstances. So dogs are able to do that to some extent, right? The dog can see this dog is playmate, this dog is threat, and then recombine based upon experience, right? Based upon interactions and encounters with various dogs, can respond to those dogs in different ways and change related to what's going on there. So what you have then with dogs then is a sort of form of what Elizabeth Camp calls minimal thought. Right? There is an element of recombinability of representations because dogs clearly have, and we have rabbits in our yard, and so Maddie, she sees the rabbit and just runs. after the rabbit. She wouldn't know what to do with it if she caught up with it, but she runs after. So there's clearly an awareness of what's going on around her and an ability to recombine this awareness in various ways that Camp identifies as a sort of form of minimal thought. But it's not full-fledged thought. That's why she calls it minimal thought. The reason it's not minimal thought is that it's not stimulus independent, is one of the words, meaning that it's dependent upon actually seeing the dog across the street before responding. Maddie doesn't sit there and get all upset because she's thinking about the dog next door. Okay. Now that's the sense in which we perhaps could say where Descartes is saying, how do we know? My students will say that. How do we know that she's not sitting there thinking about the dog next door and getting all upset about that? And even Descartes admits that, well, the only certain sign about that is that the dog will tell you, I'm upset because I'm thinking about the dog next door. But there is, and that's where there's been a lot of work in animal behavior and ethology and so on and so forth that shows that really their responses are tied to stimulus. So it's not a stimulus-independent form of thought for dogs. And it's also fairly passive with respect to being, again, not active self-generated forms of thought. It's more of a, again, response to that particular circumstance. And yet, nonetheless, it is a type of a minimal form of thought. Okay. So that's kind of where I kind of get started thinking about thought in a dog and what it might begin to look like and how we need to kind of perhaps begin to rethink what it means to think about thought itself. And at this point, I turn to Whitehead. I turn to the Symbolism book. And Whitehead as well refers to dogs. Not only Aesop's dog, but there's the example that I mentioned in a question last night. The dog sees a chair. And for the dog, the chair is not just a colored object, but it's the place where it wants to sit down, where it wants to relax. In the same way that you or I will see a chair as a place to relax, and so on and so forth. And at another point in Symbolism book, Whitehead makes reference to the fact that the future is always something that is relevant to the dog, right? That the dog is never completely purely in the present, that the future is always in some sense relevant to what's going on in that dog's experience. So there's a sense in which for a dog there's an element of expectation at work, expectation in their experience. And part of expectation means what is going to happen next. And one is looking at the cues or signs in the present, in presentational immediacy. What in presentational immediacy is a sign for what's next, okay? And picking what's relevant with respect to next is an important part of thought. Okay? So we can see already in Whitehead that he opens the door for thinking about non-human forms of thought, of symbolic thought. And he's very explicit about that and allows for thinking about dogs having a sort of minimal form of symbolic reference and symbolic thought. This leads me to another question. Granted that this lecture was 1927, and when I first read through it, I was beginning to think that maybe is Whitehead subject to the myth of the given criticism. For those who aren't familiar with that philosophical argument, Wilfrid Sellars, important philosopher, mid-20th century, argued that a big tradition in philosophy is to argue that sensory perception gives us these givens, this data, that upon which we then make certain types of inferences. Now, on the one hand, it seems that this is exactly what Whitehead is doing, right? Because we've got the color that's given, and then we make the immediate inference that that's a chair. In fact, it takes a lot of work for the artist to not make that inference. But, and Stephen Shaviro talked about this last night, what's important for Whitehead is the fact that we have no simple occurrence. We don't have a simple given. This is where Whitehead argues against the Humean and Kant, right? Interestingly, in the Symbolism, he claims that both Kant and Hume fall into the same error of thinking that experience begins with certain simple occurrences. For Whitehead, there is no simple given. So Whitehead is not subject to the myth of the given argument. So a simple presentation or a presentational immediacy isn't a simple given, but it's always in relationship to other phenomena. So one of my favorite passages then, I'll read that passage. It's in page 26 of this version. Whitehead says, the conception of the world here adopted is that of functional activity. By this I mean that every actual thing is something by reason of its activity, whereby its nature consists in its relevance to other things, and its individuality consists in its synthesis of other things, so far as they are relevant to it. In inquiring about any one individual, we must ask how other individuals enter objectively into the unity of its own experience. This unity of its own experience is that individual existing formally. We must also inquire how it enters into the formal existence of other things, and this entrance is that individual existing objectively. So the idea here then is, and this is something that Stephen talked about last night, we have this sort of the formal unity of individuality, of how the unity of experience of the actual thing that brings together things that are relevant to its individuality, but that is not what makes it objective. It's only objective when it becomes relevant to the syntheses of other actual things and other actual activities. And this was, as Stephen talked about last night, one way to resolve the Harmon problem, as he put it, right? That we can have interaction between things and maintain the differences between things and so on and so forth, with which I agree completely. But it's also at this point where I think symbolic reference enters the picture, because symbolic reference is, as Whitehead says, it's the conjunction of presentational immediacy and causal efficacy. Okay? And that's where Aesop's dog comes in, because, as he says, Aesop's dog is a bad thinker. Okay? So he even refers to the dog as a thinker, but a bad thinker. The reason Aesop's dog's a bad thinker is because he makes a faulty inference based upon presentational immediacy. He sees the reflection of the meat in the water, infers that there's actually meat causing that presentational immediacy, goes for the meat, but in the process loses the meat that was in his mouth. Okay. Now that is very important, I think, for Whitehead. And as Roland mentioned in his paper, I think one of the driving incentives, I think, for Whitehead in this book is politics. Because he ends in the last few chapters basically talking about propaganda, false consciousness, and various ways in which we can come to act upon a sort of a propagandistic notion out of habit or reflex without actively thinking about it. Okay? And so it's this distinction between reflex and sort of more conscious awareness that becomes a crucial distinction for Whitehead in the later parts of the Symbolism book. And I think he's building up to that, but he's doing that in a way that kind of gets to the root or basis of thought itself. So that's the first section. The first section then is kind of laying through the sort of notion of minimal thought as a kind of basic form of sort of type of symbolic awareness of making minimal inferences. In the case of a dog, it's usually in a very concrete context or circumstance, but it is nonetheless a form of thought, both for Whitehead and I think for many others. And I think that's where Whitehead's an important philosopher, because he anticipates some of the work that's been done more recently. The second section, I address some of the reasons why language tends to be seen as the real indication of thought. And the main reason for that is the notion of stimulus independence. And the idea of stimulus independence is that you can respond even in the absence of stimulus, or you can generate a thought in the absence of stimulus. Emile Benveniste, who was a linguist, who was influential on a number of philosophers, including Deleuze and Guattari, has this concept of indirect discourse. And one of the discussions here is this notion of, can a bee capable of indirect discourse. And the general assumption is no, a bee cannot. So for instance, as some of you may know, when a bee comes back to a hive after having seen a patch of flowers, it will do a little wiggle dance. And that wiggle dance will then be interpreted by the bees who witness the wiggle dance, and they will go off and fly to that patch of flowers. But a bee who didn't see the wiggle dance can't communicate that wiggle dance onto another bee who didn't see it, right? So they can't do indirect communication. Right? They can't, you have to have been witness to the flower patch to be able to do the wiggle dance, and you have to be in the presence of that wiggle dance to understand it. You can't pass on that wiggle dance indirectly. That's an important concept, and what's key to that is, and I think in the context of Camp's work and even to some extent Whitehead's work, is this notion of stimulus independence. So that's what I mean by stimulus independence, is that you can pass on the meaning of a thought in the absence of stimulus that provoked the thought in the first place. Okay. How does that come about? In the second section, is that how much time I have? Yes. Okay. In the second section, I look at sort of instrumental reasoning or instrumental thought, the use of tools as a certain kind of way in which one begins to kind of develop a type of stimulus-independent thought. And the basic idea here is that you're doing something in the present that is like a chimpanzee working on a tool without even it being at the circumstance or place where that tool is going to be used. So there's a sense in which instrumental reasoning or use of tools entails the beginnings of thinking of something outside the actual context of use or where it will actually be put into practice. And this leads then to this notion that I wanted to focus on again. Another one of my favorite quotes is this distinction between the automatic realization of norms and the interpretation of causal efficacy. Now, this is probably one of the key points for me, at least, of the Symbolism book, because as Whitehead goes on to argue, what becomes increasingly important for maintaining the society of molecules or the society of life is that they act within the norms of environmental obligations, right? They act within the norms that are necessary for survival. A rock does that very, very well. Now, that might sound like a kind of a flippant thing to say, but that's exactly what Whitehead says. In the book, I'll read passage, page 64, he says, "A rock is nothing else than a society of molecules, indulging in every species of activity open to molecules. I draw attention to this lowly form of society in order to dispel the notion that social life is a peculiarity of the higher organisms. The contrary is the case. So far as survival value is concerned, a piece of rock with its past history of some 800 millions of years far outstrips the short span attained by any nation. The emergence of life is better conceived as a bid for freedom on the part of organisms, a bid for a certain independence of individuality with self-interests." So then he goes on and talks about sensitive individuality as a key component to what happens with the emergence of life. So what I claim argues is going on here is that for a living individual, part of being sensitively aware of the world entails being able to interpret causal efficacy based upon presentational immediacy. Right? A dog, Aesop's didn't do that very well, right? He made a mistake when it comes to, but as Stephen mentioned last night and as Roland mentioned, the ability to be aware of causal efficacy and to interpret causal efficacy well is key to living perceptual beings. A rock doesn't have to worry about what's relevant to its continued existence. It sort of automatically has already chosen in advance what's necessary for its continued existence, whereas we have to continually interpret what's necessary for our continual existence. So there's this kind of continuum between a reflex action, sort of an automatic response to presentational immediacy, to a conscious awareness of the relationship between presentational immediacy and causal efficacy. That conscious awareness or interpretation is key. That leads then to the third section, because one of the things that Camp argues that I find is limited about her view is that she basically says that all thought is ultimately tied to thoughts that have some sort of practical application. Okay, that one thing that humans can do is entertain some absurd thoughts as hypotheses, that the brain is mind, but that's not something that was once seen as an absurd thought, but now is seen as core tenet in many forms of science. And what she does is she kind of limits thought to those circumstances. And what I argue that's going on in sort of in the third part of this essay is that thought really has to be seen as a kind of both deterritorializing and reterritorializing, right? And let me close with this sort of example to kind of tie it all together. Just finished writing a book on Deleuze and Guattari's What is Philosophy, and I focused on the concept of learning to help make sense of that. And I think learning taps into what I would call the pan-vitalist and panpsychist tendencies. So the pan-vitalist tendency is, and that's actually Humean, I would argue. I think that in many ways Deleuze is a Humean, that we need to have an element of consistency in order to learn something. Deleuze gives the example of a chimpanzee that's trying to find food under boxes of a particular color. At first, so it's got this problem space. This problem space is find the food, and it's picking up boxes randomly. And as Deleuze points out, there is a paradoxical point where there's a consistency in their behavior. Right? They're not making as many mistakes as they did before. Okay, but they haven't yet learned or come to know where the food is. Okay, it's that consistency that makes it possible to eventually identify and come to know where the food is. And so what I argue is that what's going on in both the philosophy of organism for Whitehead and what's going on in Deleuze's sort of theory of inorganic life is that all processes entail both this process of drawing a plane of consistency that then makes it possible for processes of individuation to take place. So the pan-vitalist process is the process of drawing a plane of consistency that has the potential to undo established ways of doing things and so on, because learning can fail. It can fail very miserably. But without that consistency, you wouldn't have anything new learned either, and that's where the creative element comes in, okay? But it's a difficult balance to maintain that balance between the two. And I think it's very telling that as Whitehead ends his book on symbolism, he goes back to politics and he talks about the American Revolution. And he says in the American Revolution, unlike the French Revolution, life didn't fall into chaos. That in Virginia, for instance, most of the customs, prejudices, and biases stayed the same, for better or for worse. So there was a lot that stayed the same in Virginia, so that the changes that were brought about by the American Revolution weren't too disruptive. And so I think the idea here for both Deleuze and for Whitehead is that we have to maintain this balance between sort of the pan-vitalist move towards consistency and chaos, as I would argue, and the panpsychist tendency towards recollection, thought, and unity on the other. The philosophy of organism, I think, is, for Whitehead, a way to think about that balance between the two. And this symbolism book, I think, is a very good, excellent, and short summary of, I think, that philosophy. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks to both of you. Looks like you had...
That was the fastest 30 minutes.
I know, you had no trouble filling up that extra 10 minutes. I was a little worried at first, but... well, I mean, perhaps I will give the opportunity to either of you if you want to ask one another questions, or just open the questions to the...
I'm fine just opening it.
Yeah? Okay.
May I say something?
Sure.
There's no microphone here, right? And some of the speakers have a tendency to not project very well. And that is hard on me. And last night, I mean, the content may have been brilliant, I wouldn't have known, but the speed at which that speaker spoke just was incredible for me. So I just asked that you know, people beware of that. Thank you, I'm sorry.
All right, a little slower and a little louder, everyone.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, questions for either of our speakers? Thoughts?
Okay.
Did you have a?
Michael was first.
No.
I'm just thinking that, you know, if everyone had started writing their papers even later, even later than I did, we would perhaps have more evidence in our examples as they occur here and there of current events. But I think current events are offering some concreteness that might actually be helpful, which pertains to the bad habits that went on in Virginia. So I'm just wondering, really this is a question for both of you who did such amazingly rich and marvelous papers, that it's very fortunate that a book will come forth so we can keep returning to them. But I'm wondering if this question of learning, as you're setting it forth, and of you know, deep meditation on what we do, what we do in our interpretations consciously in order to prevent mere error without shutting down the inexhaustibility might go on for us in terms of, you know, so the symbolic reflections that are going on right now very intensely, the symbolic references being practiced in mass rituals across the country with the phrases, hands up, don't shoot, and I can't breathe. So these are pretty important public efforts spontaneously arising at immediate re-symbolization, right? They're taking the ways in which symbolic gestures were very badly interpreted, much worse than Aesop's poor dog, where the clear symbol "I can't breathe" or "hands up" was simply misread as is systemically so readily available, given the training of our police forces and the history that the revolution didn't adequately disrupt. So I'm just wondering if both of you might have some reflections on the way in which error, both as inexhaustibility and as truly the deadly mistakes that get propagandistically and systemically imbricated and spread and reiterated, are getting helpfully lured by Whitehead symbolism in ways that might actually give us some help right now, give us some direction.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking about that a lot. I mean, I do think that the error is both freeing of the imagination in ways, but it's also has a tendency to become imprisoning, because we can be tied up with propaganda. I mean, I was thinking, if you're walking down the street, you see a black man with dreadlocks and a hoodie, are you going to walk across the street? I mean, a police officer sees a black person, and are they going to see them in the same way as a white person? And those sorts of reflex, right? Those reflex actions that have been built up over generations. And I think for Whitehead, the part of the goal of philosophy is to critically and consciously think through the inferences that we are making in our behaviors, because our behavior is capable of more conscious awareness than we often give ourselves credit to. But we often tend to fall into a sort of reflex behavior without even being aware of it. I mean, like I gave an example in the paper that many people just blindly and reflexively think that government is bad and markets are good. That markets are always efficient, transparent, and good for us. And those things need to be open to critical conscious analysis. And so I think there's a lot of things where a lot of meat. And that's why I think where Roland was stressing the fact that this is one of the more political writings of Whitehead, or at least has the most political implications, at least as far as I see. I think I'll let Roland fill in.
I would just say, I mean, as you mentioned, the part when he kind of tries to rearrange his philosophical notions for political reasons, and comes to appropriate presentation immediacy as a reflex, right? It's interesting that this person, I'm sorry to say it this way, but as long as you stay in this realm, it's not an error. There is no error. So therefore, the error arises already in the openness or in the realization of the arbitrariness of the reference that happens. For instance, okay, it's just a reflex that goes on and will go on until you realize it's an error, but you realize only that's an error to do so if you realize that it was an arbitrary action that has different other symbolizations as possibilities. As long as you don't, right, it's not happening as an error. So here comes together the tragic of error, but the error is only realized as error if you already realize the arbitrariness and therefore the ability to act differently in a different civilization.
So the impulse by which a policeman strikes out or acts in order to protect himself is not perhaps in its first instance the error. The error is what the failure for some kind of learning to have kicked in that opens up an alternative response.
Now, I would go even further with Whitehead. It's not just presupposing that it's a first reaction or something like this, but it's a first reaction that's culturally already ingrained. It's not just a reflex of self-defense, but of culturally ingrained patterns that are not being seen as errorable. They're just accepted. Yeah, but
so what kind of education can there be then that actually ingrains an awareness into all of these individuals and their ever very stressed out conditions, that they're working with cultural overlays that are now being overlaid by a new culture.
Well, education becomes key, and it is very important for Whitehead, as it was for John Dewey too. I mean, for similar reasons, I would argue.
I would just like to add that there was a woman on NPR this morning being interviewed who talked about having worked with lots of policemen who, and she said so many of them were not racist people. They would go to black churches on the weekends. I mean, they had a lot of, they wouldn't have a racist thought in their head, she said, but they feared black men. And so when push came to shove in those moments of stress and when the fear came up, then there was a tendency to react.
The reflex comes in. Yeah.
Right.
So it's not just about, so that's a cultural conditioning thing too. And how many generations does that go back? And why is that there? And there's a need, I think, to create a forum through which not just people can be educated in a conceptual learning sense, but have their feeling and what the historical response to that has been for them.
And that's one of the things I think is so important about Whitehead, which relates him, in my mind, to Spinoza, that all knowledge has passion and emotion and feeling behind it. It's not rational and abstract.
Right.
Michael?
Shall I reframe? I'm going to reframe my question in a slight response to you. People who would say they don't have racist thought in their head do.
Right.
But this is exactly my point, is I agree, I agree with you. But I think there's a slight problem in what you're doing. You're being slightly generous towards the analytical tradition. And my question is, I got the same question written out in different ways. I'm not sure that you were making as clear a distinction as you might between thinking about thinking, which you certainly get in Deleuze, and thinking about thoughts, which is what you get in Whitehead, I would suggest. So another way of phrasing the question was, is Aesop's dog a bad thinker, or does it have a bad thought? Because I think you were in danger of going with the presuppositions that Stephen was alluding to last night of
Okay, yeah.
cognition or consciousness being something which somehow subtends, where I think one of Whitehead's radical provocations is to look at the instance of thinking or thoughts.
Yeah.
And so, you might say, I'm not a racist, but you have a racist thought which leads to certain outcomes.
Yeah.
And then another slight problem I had was I understand about the stimulus dependence and the importance of it, but Whitehead would say that if you focus simply upon thoughts, then they are, in the sense, stimulus dependent because they are always dependent upon the social environment from which they emerge.
Yeah.
Does that make
There's a deferral.
sense?
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, that's a good distinction. But I do think in terms of, I think that the notion of expectation, the sort of the future-oriented aspect, and this kind of ties in with Roland's point about we are only aware of being mistaken when we're aware that there's other possibilities other than the thought that we have. So, does the dog even know it's made a mistake? Probably no. I mean, it goes without meat, so I suppose you can say. But in terms of, I don't want to get Darwinistic in here, but not that there's anything wrong with that. But I do think that with respect to the dynamic process of expectation of inferences into the unknown, that there is an element of uncertainty intrinsic that can't be eliminated. And that's one area where I think you might be right about analytic philosophy, though there is some moves in analytic philosophy towards what they call metaphysical indeterminacy. I still think they focus on thoughts or propositions rather than act process of thinking. So I think you're right on that point.
Dogs anticipate. I mean, that's the future.
Yeah.
If you get the lead, if you have a dog,
Yeah.
you're nice to your dog.
Yeah.
So it probably gets excited and thinks, I'm going for a walk. It's anticipating something. It is the past, in the present, and the future
Yeah.
come together. It's made a mistake when you hit it
Yeah.
because you have a bad thought.
Yeah.
So
And I
you
think
hit it, and it made an
Yeah.
error because it thought one thing, that the lead was a symbol for walkies. But it wasn't. It's
And
just-
this is in the longer version of this paper. I would contrast, and I brought this up with Stephen's talk last night, that the confirmation of experience leads to expectation in the future, that sort of Humean notion of habits. One of the things that I like, and I do this in my Deleuze's Hume book, one of the things that Deleuze liked about Hume was that habit isn't just a reproduction of past experience leading to expectations in the future. Habit can also be creative. Right? And habit can be creative because as because as elements are brought together in a sort of passive synthesis, to use Deleuze's terms, it's undetermined what the result will be. In other words, that's where learning is different from, when I use learning, I don't use learning in the sense that there's a lesson plan and a set X, Y, or Z that's supposed to be learned. Learning is the process whereby knowledge is generated, and what that knowledge is generated is not predetermined or known in advance. So I think that's where the creative process enters the picture, and you have to think about habit in a different way, and confirmation of experience and expectation in a different way than just the simple Humean habit way. And I don't even think Hume thought of it that way, but that's a whole other story.
All right, Stephen and then Adam.
Great. I want to suggest a slightly different way into the question of error that we've been talking about, and see what the two of you think about as well as anybody else in those terms. And partly, Jeff, you triggered this thought in me, however automatic or not it would be, and it's fairly automatic for me in this context, which is that you referred several times to Whitehead offering a philosophy of organism. So, and he never offers a philosophy of organism. He always refers to it as the philosophy of organism. And it's very easy sort of to overlook that and to sort of name what he does as Whitehead's philosophy of organism and so on and so forth, right? And here's an interpretation of why that distinction matters for him. And it's related to Virginia.
All goes back to Virginia.
It's related to the other side of Virginia, not West Virginia. But if on the one hand, the material you quoted, which was the side of Virginia, I don't think I've ever been in Virginia, mind you, so I'm talking about a place I've never been to. But the side of Virginia which sort of has repeated itself in current horrors, right? But there's another side to Virginia for Whitehead, which he's very explicit about why he's happy to be giving these lectures in Virginia, because he says for an Englishman, it is the site of romance. And he gives a whole sort of beautiful description of why it has this symbolic register for him. And so the pertinence to the question of the philosophy of organism or a philosophy of organism is, unlike a lot of philosophical systems, which are kind of designed to be systematic and settle matters in one way or another, and if they were to work, become everybody else's habits of thought. That for Whitehead, it's pretty clear the philosophy of organism is always an aspiration. It's an ideal, it's something he has ahead of him that he can never quite, there's a great phrase of James's, ever quite not, or something like that, right? And so there's this romance involved in the conceptualization that's always, in that way, including something of the future that he can't quite grasp, but which he can feel in one form or another. And so one might argue that one of the issues at stake right now with these various events and the responses to those events, and it's again, error is obviously for Whitehead many things, it's not just one thing. One thing has this romance capacity, but then there are these automaticities, which, so long as they remain automatic and one is totally not open to any possibility of other possibilities, that's a different kind of mistake. And so one educational gambit is to actually, again, as Whitehead is constantly trying to do, to keep one open to the possibilities of romance, even in the most dire circumstances. So that's the first common question in terms of the way of adjudicating here. But the other one, in relation to Roland's wonderful talk, which I heard most at all, but I read the rest, so I hope that passes, is I wondered if you could say a little more about your sense of the relation between Whitehead's meditations on the function of symbolism as he's writing Process and Reality, and then his meditations on the function of reason afterwards, because you use the phrase art, right, of life, and it's pretty clear that for Whitehead, reason is a romance. And so that's one continuity between the concerns in the earlier volume. But I wanted to know what you thought. So those are a bunch of thoughts.
Well, let me reorganize my presentational immediacy. So my title was taken from that romance, right? And I mean, non-analytically, I mean, not analytic philosophy, but not going into analysis of that phrase and so on. It is interesting, and I mentioned it with his combination of reason and gravitation, and then also at the end, reason appears again as enlightened reason and so on. These are all, this is, reason appears not situated in any of the perceptual modes, but is a kind of the aspiration that appears only in their relationship. And that relationship is one, on the one hand, as Whitehead sometimes say, it's relevant, but it has also certain independence from one another, which therefore never can settle. And I think at the beginning of, I would say at the beginning of Process Reality on page 4, when he combines relationality with rationalism, that's precisely what it is. There's an ever rearranging movement that he conceptualizes here in Symbolism with these 3, he says, even primitive modes of synthesis. 3 primitive modes. They are in themselves primitive and cannot be restated. So therefore, it can say it better. Reason and romance is very much related, as it is about something that is always only to be aspired to. I think what in relationship to the question that partly came up of how to understand the automatic reactions, right, as part of presentation immediacy, or even partly of both pure modes, as Whitehead says, right? They are never totally automatic anyway, as they in some way, I would say, therefore always require one another. And it's in the mutual requirement for me that reason lies, and therefore is never closed. So in this sense, I cannot more agree with the combination of reason and romance.
And I agree too. I mean, real briefly, that for my habits, I'll cite my own habits. When I think of Deleuze's distinction between a life and the life, a life is used by Deleuze to mean exactly what you're talking about when you talk about the philosophy of organism. It's indefinite, it's unsettled, it's on, and the life means an individuated life. So out of habit, when I think the philosophy of organism, I think the definitive philosophy of organism that's been individuated and established, so on and so forth. So out of habit, I make reference to a philosophy of organism, but I agree with you completely based upon your characterization. So reflex on my part too.
Make a comment. So I wanted to ask you one question. Make a comment. This is just to talk about what's going to happen over the next couple of days. Because I feel, insofar as if we are going to talk about politics and now, the emphasis in your paper was upon mutual immanence, togetherness, connectivity.
Yeah.
But the mixing of the 2 pure modes of prehension, of pure modes of perception, or prehension within propositions, is always impure. This world is impure, so
absolutely.
impurity. So everything you said was right, but I think if we're going to talk about
the whole point of the mutual requirement is that there is no purity.
Yeah, and
the whole point.
It's just that I think, when it's just the way my head is set at the minute. You were more optimistic, and so romance, it's more let's get into the impurity, the necessity of the impurity.
Absolutely.
Which is what we are now.
That's the point.
Yeah.
So
where the strange attraction happens.
We are technically out of time for this session, but maybe since Adam has been wanting to ask a question for
it's sort of, it'll flow over into the next session. I mean, I guess I don't want to ask this question because it's kind of like the annoying question that people ask at conferences, like how is this political? And I hate that question, but I have to ask that question because, in some ways, it was alluded to a number of times that this is Whitehead's political book or something like that, But we're talking about a few isolated instances in the text where he talks about something that is ostensibly political, right? But we're also talking about something like, the resymbolization, which itself is a question of life. And life is at stake in resymbolization every time. And I guess I want to encourage us to try to think about how the political is at stake here in sort of a Whiteheadian text, right? Because the way in which Jeff draws on inorganic life in Deleuze, and especially at the end of, in Deleuze's Foucault book, life is very much at stake, and it's very much a political question. Right? So inorganic life is always, or not always, but often used as a sort of political strategy that is not just simply given, but is at stake always, right? And something we need to fight for. So I'm wondering, I guess, with bringing Deleuze into the picture and talking about life and resymbolization and saying that this is, Whitehead's, this is Whitehead being political in some ways. What does the political mean in this text? I don't know if it's a question, it's more of a comment, maybe.
That's it. I guess that's a good question. So I guess if I could rephrase your question, you're asking what is at stake for Whitehead?
I would say survive.
Yeah.
This is where it comes down to.
Yeah.
with all implications.
Well, that's a provocative question to lead us into conversation. So we now have a generous 30-minute break, and it appears that some caffeinated beverages have made themselves manifest on the back table.
Themselves.
Well,
Presentationally
Yeah,
immediate.
Mr. Wall.
thank you.